Corporate fraud works best in the shadows, behind corporate walls. How does the government bring these wrongdoers to justice? Whistleblowers. These are the stories of those who risk their careers to shine a light on allegations of fraud. Today on Fraud in America.
Well, welcome to today's episode of Fraud in America. Before I forget, we are actually in New York City. This isn't our usual spot. We are at the office of Getnick and Getnick, the whistleblower law firm. They're the sponsors of our show, and they're the host of today's episode. And the reason is because today's guest is a man of mystery, a man of travel, and whenever I can find a time to sit down with him, I try to grab it. So today, our schedule's lined up for us to meet up in New York City. So I made the trip up here to meet with Tom. So I'm just going to run through some of the bullet points here for you. Tom is a graduate of Harvard. He is a Rhodes Scholar. He is a classically trained guitarist, trained in Seville, Spain, under one of the best classical guitarists. He worked at Goldman Sachs. He has lived or worked in 48 countries. He's a New York Times best-selling author. He is the real world Dos Equis most interesting man. Tom, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Jim. And with an introduction like that, it'll be a tough act to follow. Let's see if I can live up to the Dos Equis billing anyway.
So, you've written a number of books now. Last time we met was actually at our mutual friend John's place over in Italy. And I remember we were eating dinner, and I'm eating something with olive oil in it. And you go, you know about olive oil? And then that ended up becoming a book, your first book, about olive oil. What was your interest in olive oil in that time? In particular, concerns about fraud around olive oil.
Yeah, I had just finished an article on a completely unrelated subject for the New Yorker, computer chess programming. And my editor said, that was great. Now, what are you going to work on next? And I had just seen a news program in Italy where I live and spent a lot of time, about farmers blockading a port where they said that these tanker ships would come in the night. This is farmers in the southern port of Bari in Italy. They were blockading the port with their tractors and complaining about these huge tanker ships that would come in and offload this suspicious substance, which miraculously would become extra virgin Italian olive oil and undercut their, these are olive farmers.
Right.
So I thought, that's kind of a quirky thing, I might be able to write an article about that. And 6 years later, I was done with the book. So that was by chance, but it was one of those things where the fraud and the fraudsters and the good people both produced a range of incredible characters, incredibly interesting, quirky, funny, bizarre characters, scary sometimes.
Yeah.
That made it. I think that's what the success of really any good piece of writing is. Largely the characters involved, and that was quite a cast.
So I love your writing. It's not just facts and data and information. Baking in stories seems to really certainly grabs me as a reader. Is that what attracts you to stories originally, or books, or ideas? Is it character driven, or are you looking for ideas to spread?
Yeah, I that's a good question, and it probably is a chicken and the egg one, but I certainly gravitate towards quirky, interesting characters who can tell a much more complex story in a way that's digestible. The idea of olive oil, good and bad, the history of it is all very good. But if I were just to sort of trot out the facts, people would doze off after about page 20, if I was lucky. But if you find people who are really immersed in it, bad guys who are also trafficking, arms and plastique when they're not trafficking olive oil, and the good guys who are, finally have had enough and are willing to speak out. That's quite and I think really I ran into my first whistleblowers while working on olive oil fraud, because there were whistleblowers, people inside who had a lot to lose, who were willing to speak up because they just had enough.
Yeah.
And that happened in Italy, but it also happened at the FDA. There were several people who really spoke out and may well have taken some heat. Or worse after, but who really were willing to take a chance.
Yeah.
So, and I also work on history a lot. My training is in history, and I always think when I come to a topic, where did this come from?
Yes.
How did this evolve? And I think done right, that becomes an interesting way to look at things.
So your next book, Crisis of Conscience, the seminal work on whistleblowing, certainly is on every shelf of every whistleblower lawyer I know. What was it about whistleblowing that drew you? You mentioned there was a whistleblower in the olive oil story. Why did you decide to go into that area?
By chance, I happened to run across a couple whistleblower lawyers, Neil Getnick and John Phillips, at almost exactly the same time.
Yeah.
And I learned something about the False Claims Act, Lincoln Law, and my inner historian started saying, "Ooh, this is pretty cool. Wow, this is back in the Civil War, really." Yeah. And so my initial idea was, again, to write an article for the New Yorker or something about the False Claims Act, strictly speaking. But gradually I began to see, as I spoke with more and more people, and my approach is pretty wasteful, but can produce some broad-based results. I interview a ton of people. And the vast majority of people I actually don't mention in the book, but they have helped me to understand in ways that I think a more, smash and grab, more superficial reporting job would not. So I literally talked with thousands of people for that book. I mean, and as you saw it, it's sort of
600 pages.
It may be on the shelf of every whistleblower lawyer in the country, but it's on very few other shelves, unfortunately. Sad to say. But I got into to what really this book turned out to be about was fraud, waste, abuse, and corruption, the mechanisms of organizations, public and private, how they behave. And with whistleblowers as the through line, you do this too, right? Surely.
For sure.
Except when this situation is, and most organizations would say, "Oh, of course we do the right thing if we had a whistleblower," until there's a whistleblower in their organization. Yes. So there's some deep social psychology involved, which makes a whistleblower in the False Claims Act against Medicare fraud very similar to people in whistleblowing against the NSA, very similar to people who are looking at tax fraud. I mean, many different areas have a lot in common in terms of the organizational dynamics and the psychology of the whistleblower themselves.
So what did you know, or did you think you knew about whistleblowers that after talking to thousands of people, you now realize wasn't quite true going into that?
That's another very good question. I mean, I kind of assumed, having watched, a fair few heroic whistleblower films, and read a few stories, that ultimately I expected the success rate to be higher, and I expected the societal support to be stronger. I also did not know about the sharp-toothed legal remedies and helps that are available. I didn't have any idea about the False Claims Act and what that means and so on. But ultimately, I came to see that whistleblowers, the individual voice, has an unbelievable power. Again, one person can literally take on, with the appropriate legal representation and planning and a lot of time and a lot of patience and luck, can take on an entire organization. However, I think our society has a lot more to do in realizing what the whistleblower gives. They think of it as a 2-hour movie, and they get up and clap at the end, and then they walk out. And they're not thinking 10, 20, 30 years of someone's life, total loss of their career, and a total sense of, this is another thing, again and again, these people are doing what we all think we would do. They're doing the right thing, and they're being punished for it relentlessly, and their whole world seems to sort of turn upside down, because they think of themselves, in many cases, as the biggest defender of their own organization. I'm going to protect us from getting in trouble, with the law. And gradually they realize, especially when the pink slip arrives, that it's the organization, their boss's boss's boss, that has sat down and worked out this fraud scheme. But it takes them a while, and when they do that, their whole world shifts. And their good friends at the firm will not sit down with them at the lunch table. The people in the community, I interviewed some people at Hanford, the nuclear reservation there.
Sure.
Same dynamic, same everything, except that everybody in the Tri-Cities in Eastern Washington works at Hanford or works for the big contractors.
Right.
So you go against them, you're like Typhoid Mary. You are a contagious problem, and you're threatening their livelihood. So literally, people who live there, they're ostracized at their workplace, but they're also ostracized in their community. So I think we as a society need to really focus a lot more on money is critically important. The Europeans don't even get that. To at least make good financially, give them a chance to make good financially, the loss. Although I have to say, 9 out of 10 times, you just put your head down and get with the fraud, you're going to make more money than if you blow the whistle.
Right.
9 times out of 10. But you can do the right thing. But at the same time, the society needs to realize that this approach needs to take into account the whistleblower well-being way, way more. And a few films where the whistleblower comes out the hero do not reflect what real whistleblowers go through and continue to go through.
You touch on something I think it's really important, that in companies, a lot of times these large companies that settle cases, the whistleblower is one of many people that knew about the fraud, but they're the few that decided to swim upstream. Are there common traits that you recognized in talking to all these whistleblowers that you saw time and time again?
There certainly are. It was sometimes difficult when, speaking to a whistleblower after the fact, it's sometimes difficult to know how much was innate and how much was rationalization after the fact, right? But a lot of times I heard these same things. Many times people came from small communities or were very, very aware that other people were aware, and then their actions had consequences. They were professionals who had a lot of training, so they were mature enough and experienced enough to say, no, actually, in the nuclear engineering code on page 999 it says X, but not so senior that they were in the C-suite with all of those incentives. So mid-range, a bit like colonels in the armed forces. They're the ones that will blow the whistle. If they're a general, probably not.
Right.
But the colonels know what's going on. More junior than that, they may miss it. So and then just a kind of a sense of white and black, right and wrong, and no wiggle room. Several people said, I'm a kind of a rules girl.
Yes.
I'm about rules. Others said, I couldn't put my children to sleep at night if I didn't do that. I have to look myself in the mirror every morning.
Yes.
That kind of thing, where it's a conscience, a matter of conscience, and somehow, some way, and an independence also, an independent background, quite often not having come up through this usual hoops that you go through to get to be whatever, an investment banker, a lawyer, but maybe coming in laterally, maybe growing up in an unusual place. I think of Ellen Butler-Kunz, who was one of my great whistleblowers in healthcare fraud, who grew up in a tiny town in Norway, where everybody knew everybody, and it was a sort of a sandbox rule. You don't beat up on vulnerable people, and she brought that, and she loved living in Florida and loved working for her hospital, but she brought that sense of that's not right, and that gave her both the strength to speak out when everyone else was like, well, this is the way things are done. She knew a different way, and ultimately a sort of a sense of worst comes to worst, I go back home. She loved being in Florida, but if you were born and raised in Florida, you didn't have Plan B. You're like, that's where I'm from, right? And she knew. So there's a sort of a combination of things. It's also timing in one's career. You're maybe approaching retirement, or people who have a mortgage, and this is why, unfortunately, they're kind of targeted people. Employers who are up to no good love to get people kind of under their thumb, right? And so financially, that's a kind of a powerful weapon. So a range of different characteristics that I think contributed at least to blowing the whistle.
And then I guess, so for me, absolutely true. Certainly in the clients and the whistleblowers I've interacted with over the last 20 years, they're the should have been employees of the month. Right? They're saying this is, out of all these regulations that Medicare has put in place, this is the one we're violating right here. And it's oftentimes this assumption that people just aren't understanding. And then there comes a point where oh wait, no, this is top-down business plan fraud. This it's driving the boat here.
And it must be a very, very sinking feeling to say, oh,
I think that's right.
My goodness,
Right.
All this company that I'm proud of, that I'm defending, that I'm building my life around. It's not what I thought it was.
So you talked about that after the fact whistleblower, and a lot of whistleblowers struggle with their identity after they're no longer whistleblowers. Can you talk about that? How you interacting with whistleblowers after their case is done, and what they do now, right? That now what feeling.
Yeah, that is such a crucible moment and crucible years when they're going through litigation. First of all, they're deciding to blow the whistle. Then they're deciding how, who to team up with, and of course the teamwork with the right whistleblower lawyer firm. People at TAF are banner carriers for that. But you getting the right person, and then utter trust, and then years of legwork, usually, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Getting that first complaint absolutely bulletproof, making sure you have facts. Are there other whistleblowers who can contribute to this? Are you on the radar already at the firm? What do you do? When do you resign? Do you resign? All of these, and at the same time undergoing the stress of family. What is my worst case scenario? We lose our house. All these things. So they have gone through this crucible moment that may have lasted for years, and all they can think about is their case. Yeah. And when that's over, and with luck, they have a good result, because as we know, many do not, even with very, very good representation. Then there is clearly a period of time where they're still thinking about it, is that all there is to life? And then I've seen several anyway just turn their back on the whole thing and just try to turn over a new leaf, just try not to think about those years anymore, which is in a sense a waste of an incredible resource of knowledge and but it's also very understandable. Put that behind me, move on with my life. Because being identified as a whistleblower, you become, the firm, the bad guy, labels you as a whistleblower, as if to say this is the problem, right? They shift trying to shift the focus from themselves doing bad things to this rogue employee, disgruntled, maybe psychologically unstable. And they try to throw all this stuff, and you can't help but feel like you have a target on you. So you become the whistleblower. Getting rid of that identity is, and on the other hand, there are a few who say, why should I, just as brain surgeons don't just do one operation then move on to something else. Yeah. Great whistleblowers have that experience, have that knowledge, have that, and a few that I know have turned to doing more whistleblower work, doing consulting work, or finding more cases. And I always laugh when the corporations say, "Oh, a serial whistleblower," as if you'd say, "Oh, a serial brain surgeon."
Right.
How immoral is that? He did it twice.
Right.
She actually did 4 operations. I mean, it's just insane. Yeah. So same deal with whistleblowing. Serial whistleblower for me that's a good thing. Yes. You've got a track record. You know how to do this. You know where the bodies are buried. Do it.
Very true. Yeah, certainly. You think about the whistleblowers who have had this track record of they have instant credibility with the government. They walk in. Oh yeah. There's fraud happening over here. You think about like Harry Markopolos and Madoff. When he speaks now, people at the government listen.
People really pay attention. Yeah.
And you mentioned Ellen. Ellen sits on our board now, encouraging other whistleblowers to step forward. She shares her story, right? So, it's a very interesting story. So you mentioned that she's from Norway. Why are we not seeing the same embrace of whistleblowers in Europe? You mentioned Europe. You live in Europe, but why are we not seeing the proliferation of whistleblower statutes in Europe right now, do you think?
Well, in certain cases, Italy being one, Germany being another, the identity of the whistleblower is often blended with something extremely unpleasant. Like in Italy, mafia turncoat and whistleblower. Yeah, sure. It's just sort of a, and I'm not saying that some mafia turncoats aren't doing a great service, but they're still mafiosi with blood on their hands. Right. Or in Germany, both Nazi informers and Stasi informers get blended into this whistleblower thing. And so existing law that came in after World War II saying no more of that, it takes a big bite. And in other places, there's this tendency to say, they're disloyal, they're not team players, and in an organization, it's the same kind of mentality. There is also a rejection, at least so far, of the notion that monetary payments should be made. Yeah. And that, I think, is the most ridiculous of the many objections that the Europeans, on the whole, make, because they simply don't recognize that when you blow the whistle, you're putting your entire livelihood on the line and your future career. And you may well never work again in your chosen field. And that is, apart from the psychological, the social, the everything else, familial implications that it has, that's a huge, financial loss and a huge financial risk. And so they're thinking of bounty hunters and payoff, and you slide them a thick stack of bills, and then they give you the. It's just so upside down. It really is, and it's kind of disappointing. But I think gradually. I mean, on paper at least, the the recent whistleblowing legislation that was written in 2019, 2020, that's still kind of on the shelf and being implemented. That, at least on paper, has some gold standard elements to it. There's some very, very good things about the whistleblower legislation, and institutionalizing the role of the whistleblower that I think is positive. So they may be catching up, and they may be actually passing the U.S. government in certain areas.
Right. So there might be hope.
Yeah, there's definitely hope. Yeah.
So the title, Crisis of Conscience, what's the meaning behind that?
Yeah, I was playing for a while with crimes of conscience, which of course is wrong because it's not a crime to blow the whistle, and ultimately I changed that. But many times, whistleblowers themselves said, I felt like I was breaking the law here because all of my buddies, all of my coworkers, and I was turning against them. And sometimes you do break the law in order to serve a higher good, and that law is like illegal orders, illegitimate orders in the army. You do not follow illegitimate orders and slaughter those civilians, right? But you're still breaking the law. So anyway, but crisis of conscience, I think it was better, and it captures a sense. Because the subtitle is Whistleblowing in an Age of Fraud. It really captures the sense that I had as I wrote it, that I went from industry to industry to industry to government department to government department to government department. And frankly, it's a low bar. I mean, there's a lot of just institutionalized corruption. A lot of just what used to be even is considered corruption, which is now just the way the game is played. Acceptance of conflicts of interest, acceptance of the revolving door as a decent way to do things, acceptance of financial profit motive in everything, without exception, as a good thing.
Yes.
Acceptance of markets as the ideal way for humans to interact. Those are big acceptances, and they have consequences, and we've reached them. So when Trump got elected, and I want to make this a political thing, that was sort of, here's what you get. Here's where we are. As my book was coming out, Trump had been elected, but as I was writing most of it, it was late Obama and then Trump, and it just felt like that kind of said, you see what I mean? So the book turned into a kind of an exploration of the conscience of the nation, really, and what happened to individual conscience.
Interesting.
Because when you join a group, the danger is that if that group goes sideways, your individual conscience just gets subsumed, and it's either follow the leader, so authoritarian, or it's follow your peers, peer pressure. And those are two very powerful things, very, very well understood. And I about 10 pages of my book, maybe the best 10 pages of my book, just give you a condensed version of what we know about conflicts of interest and how we're just choosing to ignore it.
So, by the way, I've read the book twice,
all
600 pages. So it's a fabulous read. Highly recommend to anybody who's interested in white-collar crime or corporate malfeasance. It really is an excellent read. One of the frustrations that I know whistleblowers have, even when they're successful monetarily, they look across the table and they see the CEO not wearing orange or pinstripes, but wearing pinstripes with a suit and getting rewarded for basically navigating the company through the corporate waters and paying a fine and nobody going to prison. Do you see that same frustration when you talk to whistleblowers?
Hugely. They see, on the one hand, the bad guys prospering. They lose their job, the bad guys prosper. And as one Texas former prosecutor said to me, Tom, until you fit those guys out with orange jumpsuits, nothing's going to change.
100%.
And it just has to be. And that is another thing that is widely understood, but it's inconvenient. And so we don't do it. It's time we did. These people need to be fitted out with orange jumpsuits, and we need to have the legal tools to be able to do that. At the same time, they're seeing the victims of their crime not represented, even in their wonderful work, even in their lawsuits. The people who actually suffered, they're not at the table.
Right.
So it's the firm, the whistleblower, the DOJ, if I'm talking about a false claims suit, but many others.
Yep.
And allegations and losses, but the actual victims, they're nowhere to be seen, and they never receive a cent. So that was another repeated unease that many whistleblowers express to me. It's like, I did all this, but
Yeah.
and maybe I succeeded, maybe I did in my own to support my own family.
Yeah.
But those people, they're still out in the cold. So yeah, it's tricky. It's an imperfect situation. It's way better than nothing, and it does make a dent. But they also say, well, we settled, and they paid $400 million, and their stock price went up.
Right. Right.
What?
The uncertainty of litigation's behind us now. So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
It's all good for us. And yeah. So ultimately, it's a complex set of problems. But whistleblowers do have a lot to keep in their brains and a lot of emotionally to absorb.
Yeah. So very cool that we're meeting today. Your new book, is hitting stands today. I have a copy here. I checked Amazon before I came in today. It's already number one on a category in Amazon on day one. How to Make a Killing: Blood, Death, and Dollars in American Medicine. Tom, I read it last night, so it's very fresh in my memory. Why this topic of dialysis fraud?
Well, it was one of the many huge benefits of doing a deep dive into whistleblowing, because one of the original chapters of my book on whistleblowing was in dialysis, and I realized very early on this is its own book, so I sort of siloed that and moved on. But this is a topic that the level of litigation, the number of whistleblowers, the kinds of misconduct that were alleged, and so on is quite eye-popping. And I was lucky to speak with a number of really high-level whistleblowers, many of whom represented by folks at TAF, and to get their views of things. Sometimes just before they signed a very restrictive non-disparagement agreement, so I really got a number of really great stories, and it taught me a lot about the False Claims Act, and it taught me a lot about whistleblowers. But it also gave me a real insight into an area of healthcare which is historic, and really it was visionary when it happened in the 60s and 70s. It kind of ushered in high-tech medicine, but at the same time it represents where America was 60 years ago in its health, and where America is broadly based in its healthcare today. And so dialysis as a window on American healthcare is really appealed to me as a story that needs to be told right now.
So true. So when I'm reading this story, by the way, the history section was fascinating, right? Dating back to 1972, and this law is put in place in which Medicare is going to cover dialysis for everyone, which led to this flood of outpatient dialysis centers. Can you talk a little bit about that and why that shift from really the hospital setting or even home setting, but this outpatient setting for dialysis was so important?
Yeah, absolutely. Basically, the growth of dialysis in America is a tale of two cities. You have Seattle with building Scribner and Company at University of Washington Medical Center, and they were focused on, and then you have Boston and Harvard Medical School, both of whom doing cutting edge work, both in transplantation and in building dialysis machines and access. And both of whom faced with the same problem. They were succeeding. They were actually keeping their patients alive for a significant period of time, which before dialysis, it was a death sentence. You were done in a day, 2 days, a week. There was nothing you could do. Yeah. And all of a sudden, miracle medicine, this is the first human organ replaced by a machine ever. And so both of these teams asked to expand their dialysis unit in their hospitals. And both hospitals said, no. Not going to happen, because we see the potential for paying enormous amounts of money to. At the time, back in the 60s, I think it was the University of Washington Center was charging people $30,000 a year, which is something like $280,000 in real. I'm trying to remember.
Yes.
But it's a substantial amount of money per year.
Right.
And the hospital said. Most hospitals said no, thank you. So the Seattle team went nonprofit. They did fundraisers. They got federal funding. They opened a series of one, and then it grew into the Northwest Kidney Centers, which is still in operation today, still doing very, very good work, and proud of that history. Directors financial partners in these units because it's good. This is Milton Friedman, and this is the same time that Milton Friedman, Reagan was about to come online. In fact, these same Harvard MDs then turned entrepreneurs. The doctor entrepreneur is a new figure of the 1960s and 70s, a new thing, because the AMA until shortly thereafter said medicine must not be a stock and trade. It must not be profit.
Yes.
And all of a sudden, the Supreme Court, in its great wisdom, outlawed that, along with several other cases of professional organizations presuming to limit the earning potential of their members. So the AMA said, okay, never mind, and profit whoosh in. So all this was coming together, and the Harvard MDs turned entrepreneurs, and they were real boardroom bandits too. Some of them were real, Gus Hampers was a real swashbuckler in the Mike Milken mold. Not quite. Take it back. But sort of.
Right.
And they made National Medical Care, NMC, which became the first giant dialysis organization, the first dialysis giant. And their thing was brick and mortar to the masses, and legitimately, at least at first, because a lot of people were dying. I mean, part of the kind of a fascinating but heartbreaking story of the Seattle dialysis center was they instituted, because they had 20 applicants for every chair, or 50 applicants for every chair, they instituted what they called the admissions committee, which rapidly became known as the God panel or the life and death committee. And basically, it was a cross-section of society, because the hospital felt that the doctors themselves could not be making these life and death things. So there was a housewife, and there was a banker, and there was a lawyer, and there were and a minister, and they would working with anonymized documents decide who lived and who died, because if you were taken in, you had a good chance of living for a decade or more. If you didn't, you were dead in days or weeks. And so that was a big deal, and that got picked up by the media. And that got picked up by some very, very powerful. It really got into the conscience of a lot of doctors. So this is actually one of the leading forces behind the birth of the field of bioethics.
Yeah,
I mean, patient selection and who decides. Also, the high-tech medicine thing, the human dependency on this high-tech machine for survival was a new thing. So bioethics really got a huge boost out of this, and it was in the same years that bioethics became popular. But at the same time, Congress was saying, "Whoa!" Life magazine is writing a cover story, and Edwin Newman is doing "Who Lives" on CBS, and so we better get on this. And sure enough, it became a hot button topic, because some very smart people were on in the positive side, lobbying in a positive way to explain to people this is. And they framed it as a huge threat to the American dream, kidney failure. And there was this wonderful scene where Shep Glazer, a salesman from upstate New York, dialyzes on the floor of the House Ways and Means Committee, and a senior staffer who came in late walks in, looks at it, and goes, "What the is going on here?"
Right.
And you can imagine. But it really got people's attention. And Shep Glazer was a salesman, a good salesman, and he said to the congressman, "Look." I can survive now. If this had happened a year ago, I would be dead, but I can survive, but I can't pay the bills. Do you want me to sell my house? Do you want me to lie? Do you want me to, because he tried to pay, to earn more by selling a competing line, and it broke some company rule, and he was fired for his troubles. So do you want me to sell my house? The American dream is and he kind of pitched that as the kidney failure is a threat to the American dream. Same time, Edwin Newman was saying, he had senators and Congress people come on and say, well, we're spending I don't know how many billions to build up our nuclear arsenal. We've got these sick people. We should be taking care of them first. Yes. So it became a real threat to the American dream. There's a solution. Congress needs to act. And sure enough, after some very intense negotiating and everything over the space of about 7 years, Richard Nixon, in 1972, signs dialysis into law as the first, and so far the only, Medicaid for all, major. I mean, there are tiny Lou Gehrig's disease and a couple other carve-outs, but mainly it's dialysis. But remember, Jeb, this is at a time when both Democrats and Republicans had huge momentum to institute national health. This was the first step of national health. Most people just thought, well, this is the phase one, then we're going to do the rest.
Yes.
And you know, Cap Weinberger, who was, you know, pretty much a hawk literally in many ways, he had the most, you know, remarkably visionary proposals for healthcare for all from the Republican side, and Edward Kennedy had even better ideas, and everyone was moving towards this. And then we had, of course, you know, stumbled and fell. We had Watergate, and Vietnam consumed Nixon, and then stagflation and the OPEC oil embargo and economic chaos, and all of a sudden the huge shift away from, you know, the New Deal, but also the Great Society social programs, of which national healthcare would have been one, to cost cutting, you know, fiscal responsibility. In other words, cutting costs wherever you could. And at the same time, the Reagan, Milton Friedman, private does it better, outsource to for-profits, and gradually downsize the government until, you know, the famous phrase, you can drown it in a bathtub. Yeah, and that was the death of national health.
Wow. Right. Along with, you know, government's not the solution, it's the problem, and
Precisely.
Everything should shift to privatization. Yeah.
Yeah, and you see, I mean, again, this is a bit off the topic, but you see where that came from, but then you take it to the other extreme, and that's where we are now. Yeah. We have basically huge and ravenous corporations who have all kinds of legal protections to simply put their conscience to one side. And, you know, the whole argument that that Milton Friedman asked an argument, the only responsibility of a corporation is, you know, profits. Profits and profits. That's brought us to where we are today.
So during the same time, a little bit off the path here for us, NME, National Medical Enterprises, launched in '69, went from a company of 3 lawyers to this colossal $4 billion corporation, doing a lot of the things that we read about in this book happening in the dialysis world. Can you talk about NME and the playbook that they used?
Yeah, NME was a fascinating experiment in incentives, frankly, and it was a Richard Emer and 2 fellow attorneys who basically pivoted from they rolled up a number of hospitals and healthcare units, including psychiatric hospitals. And then there was a change in reimbursement policy that the Medicare and Medicaid were going to be much more vigilant and much less generous on reimbursing in a wide range of the units that they owned, but not psychiatric hospitals. And so they offloaded a lot of the other things and focused on psychiatric hospitals. And then they cranked up the sales machine, which is essentially the model was, you know, you get as many privately insured people as you can, and you keep them as long as you can. And when their insurance runs out, you discharge them. Now, if people were truly needing psychiatric care, we have no disagreement about this.
Yeah.
However, there are many allegations of them not only simply not needing psychiatric care, but actually being swept up off the streets. I mean, you know, kids, and particularly kids, because there was a longer insurance coverage than there would be for adults. So kids with private insurance were like, that's what they were after.
Yeah.
And there are reports from one of the great lawyers that I have talked with a number of times about this, who really went after NME, Jim Moriarty down in Texas, and he has thousands of cases where school counselors and coaches and pastors and various others were being paid a bounty to report kids who might need a little extra, you know. And the sales, he tells this great story of the intake. The intake essentially consisted of a salesperson, and literally some of them were used car salesmen before they did this, sitting in an office. You, a parent, come in with your child, and you're worried, and there's, or maybe your child's already in the back, and you're saying, what's happened?
Yeah.
Anyway, one of the first questions was, are you privately insured? And the answer was yes. You hit the wall, and the people behind you start going in on the paperwork. I mean, it was a fraud factory, and at the same time, you're incarcerating people who don't need to be incarcerated. And there was one case of Christy Scheck out in San Diego, a young girl who, with some emotional problems, but who basically was incarcerated in a facility where the other way you make money, of course, one of the many ways they made money was firing all the skilled staff and hiring in very under-trained people because you pay them less, right?
Sure.
That's a layup. And if you're really not worried about health care, that's what you do. She was incarcerated, held in this facility without proper supervision, and she hung herself. And so that kind of broke the dam. And it ended up being north of $700 million settlement. The FBI raided a bunch of the different facilities. Richard Emer and company escaped with golden parachutes, and thanks from I recently read an amazing document. Thanks from the LA Chamber of Commerce for being a visionary and I love that word visionary. Every time I see that, I think,
Alarm bells start going off.
So
Yes.
Could be good, could be not so good.
Yep.
Anyway, so it was a genuine fraud factory and doing harm that was brought down by concerted effort of law enforcement and a very, very good group of lawyers, and so that was a positive outcome.
Yeah, and then later came back as Tenet, right? Was rebranded.
Yes, yes, exactly. Because things continue to. I mean, again, if you don't put people in jail, if you don't really root out the problems, then they reemerge. Yeah. And so and Tenet has its own story of having major problems, and then Tenet itself was a rebranding, right?
For sure.
And then, but that didn't work out so well, and more allegations of fraud, more C-suite people who moved on with golden parachutes, and then and restart. And Chuck Grassley writing them a letter at a certain point saying, as far as I can see, I'm paraphrasing, but your company has absolutely no moral rectitude whatsoever. And he was pointing out that after the rebranding, something like 70% of the original directors remained in this brand new Tenet organization.
It's a new day,
New day, same people.
Yes.
So there's a lot of smoke and mirrors there. But ultimately, to change the corporate culture, I mean, you have to start from scratch. You have to start with really sending a message that, yes, you made a lot of money, but now you're going to jail for a while, or you're going to lose all that money, or whatever. But also new people who see it differently. And if you don't do that, then those people are going to continue what they were doing.
The playbook just gets put in place again.
Yeah,
Right.
and the PR machine,
Yeah.
cranks up, and your lobbyists in Washington help that process, and off you go.
So you mentioned lobbyists. So a lot of this is driven by Medicare reimbursement rates, right? So the psychiatric world, doing dialysis in a clinic as opposed to at home. Can you talk about the lobbying efforts in the dialysis world to make sure that the Medicare rates stay high?
Well, the lobbying has been a big part of big dialysis since National Medical Care. I mean, they had John Sears, the former campaign director of Ronald Reagan, as their key lobbyist, and they made sure that certain things like home dialysis were disincentivized and so on. Where they have not been terribly successful is keeping Medicare rates high. I mean, $250 per treatment.
Yeah.
I think there's a very good argument that that's not sufficient. I'm not going to make any friends probably in Medicare by saying that, but that is bare bones. So when the big dialysis corporations say we make all of our money on privately, I'm not sure I believe that, but it is true that the current bundled rate for dialysis is rock bottom, and it's kind of an invitation to, I think I'm not an expert, but from the experts I've spoken with, a lot of people say that that it has not kept up with the times. It should be higher. The problem is, if you're in cost-cutting mode, you're in cost-cutting mode. And cost-cutting mode almost invariably runs head-on into patient well-being. If you're really cutting costs, you're going to start doing a utilitarian analysis of this and saying, well, the greater good, we don't bankrupt our country, and so people die a little sooner. So I have had very, very senior nephrologists, very good thinkers on this, say the corporations are a big part of the problem, but we're also dealing with CMS, Medicare authority, that is either not sufficiently independent from the corporations or not providing sufficient funds for the treatment.
So just to make sure I understand, would you be advocating for Medicare to bump up its rates to be more competitive with private insurance, to stop some of the allegations that are in this book so that they're more equal? We don't have this shifting of care to private insurance.
I'm not sure that I am in a position to be an advocate one way or the other, but my understanding has been that the current bundle rate is not high enough, and that perhaps the private, the big dialysis focus on, or small dialysis, even any really small dialysis organization, same thing, relentless focus on private insurers, is partly because they really, they're not getting paid enough on Medicare. But I'm not in a position to be, to really pronounce authoritatively on what should be done. I've just heard a number of people say that $250 a treatment is not enough.
Okay. So big dialysis, it's a duopoly basically, right? We have two companies that seem to be the biggest players. Can you talk about those two companies?
Yeah, they're two very large, publicly traded, multinational corporations. One is Fresenius, and it's Fresenius North America is connected to the mother company, which is German, and DaVita is homegrown American. They, last time I checked, they had a combined market cap of about $50 billion. Warren Buffett owns a substantial portion of DaVita, and gives it the Buffett blessing. They're very, very successful on Wall Street. They're the darlings of Wall Street. They're recently, and I think COVID has impacted that somewhat, but they're very successful financial firms. And they've grown rapidly, and over the space of the last 20 years, they have acquired, ultimately they are the final acquirers of an enormous swath of smaller organizations in a process that really is a roll-up, in industrial terms, that was done under the radar in many cases of the FTC. There's a $5 million, whatever it is, cutoff, below which the FTC is not going to vet your purchase. And even back in the day when, and today, thank goodness, when the FTC actually does pay attention to antitrust, they didn't come up. But the net result is that these two corporations essentially treat 80% of America's dialysis patients. And worse, if you think about it, you're a dialysis patient, you live in your home, and you need treatment 3 times a week for 3 or 4 or 5 hours. Typically it's 3 because it's, but it should in some cases be 4 or longer. So you need something near your home. You are not a flexible consumer. You can't go on Amazon and get better dialysis. You need something right there, or better yet, in your home. We'll get to that. Because home dialysis is absolutely the best way to go for a lot of people. But the fact is, you live in a place where, in many cases, the markets have been divided up among Fresenius and DaVita, and there's only one show in town. So you have a de facto monopoly in many and regional and local markets. And that, is a problem, right? We know this is a problem. Anti-competitive laws are in place for a reason. And we've just, we've been asleep at the switch.
So you tell the story about Arlene Mullen, I think her name was, in a mobile home down in Georgia, and the crusade that she is on to try to fight for people who are involuntarily discharged in some of these areas. Can you talk about her story and what she's doing?
Arlene Mullen is one of the great people I've met in my reporting career. She's an unbelievable character. She's tough when she needs to be, just tough as nails, because she goes against, but she's got a heart as big as the state of Georgia. I went down and visited her in Arlington, Georgia, when she was living in a borrowed trailer home, and was living off of her Social Security checks, and she has been an advocate for patients in harm's way, dialysis patients in harm's way, for 23 years now.
Wow.
Unpaid, and doing it out of and I'm telling you, she when I was there, she had her phone to her ear 90% of the time. It would, she'd click off around midnight to go to sleep, and she'd click on, and these are calls from patients, from workers, because again, workers are also in harm's way. They're overworked in many cases. They have staffing shortages. They're forced, and they feel, at least they express to her and to me, that they're contributing in some way to the ill health of the people that they've been sworn to cure, or to care for, I should say.
Yeah.
Anyway, Arlene, she started in dialysis back when dialysis in a private center run well. She saw how dialysis workers became members of the dialysis patients' families, so they spent so much time together. There was a deeply caring, a strong bond between her and her patients. They lived for a long time, and so she really got to know them, care about them, and then her unit was bought out by a bigger for-profit concern, and that all went out the window. They started a draconian cost-cutting, where they would ration gauze and needles, and they wouldn't give them ibuprofen because it wasn't on the chart, and shorten treatment times, all the other things that you can do to get more people in. They fired a lot of the skilled nurses and replaced them with low-skilled techs, and predictably bad stuff started happening. I mean, the patients started one of the things that she mentions as kind of a tragedy is tension grew in the facility, and people started arguing. And they never used to argue. There was always this, but there's so much. The workers were under pressure because they were now shorthanded, and and the patients were not getting the cures they need. Another kind of side note on this is, if you have proper dialysis, well, let's say if you have improper dialysis, if your dialysis is too short and too fast, you are not getting, let's say, the cleansing that you need, and you're also going to have symptoms from dragging off fluid too fast. You're going to have headaches, nausea, vomiting, tingling, cramping, terrible cramping, and other things. And so you don't want to do that anymore.
Yeah.
You don't want to do the treatments anymore. A lot of doctors who are young enough not to know what good dialysis is say, well, these people are non-compliant. They don't come in for the treatments. Well, because they're not getting the treatment, which makes them sick. I heard a very senior, Alan Collins, a very senior nephrologist at the annual dialysis conference in 2018, said we are creating a disease state, a new disease state with short treatment times, high ultrafiltration rate, So it's no wonder that, when people say, oh, they're non-compliant, it's their fault. Well, yeah, they're doing it, it's sort of a form of torture, and they don't want to do that anymore. So come back to Arlene. She sees what happens when profit trumps patient care. At least in her view, that's what happened. And she blew the whistle. Another whistleblower. She blew the whistle on her facility to the state. It was Oregon, to the state healthcare facility. The next day, although she called a anonymous whistleblower hotline, her bosses pulled her in and berated her for reporting, and then started getting the clinic ready for the inspection. She quit, and she became an advocate. And actually, it was a moving story. At that time, her husband was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and he had very little time to live. He had been kind of against her doing this, and then he got this diagnosis, and he made her promise to continue.
Wow.
To continue to stand up for patients. And she still is today. She's 73, 74 years old, and she's still doing her thing. But it should not be all on Arlene Mullen. For sure. This should be nationwide. There should be proper oversight. We'll talk about that too. But my reporting indicates that the industry is not sufficiently regulated.
So some of the things that Arlene saw when this private company came in, the standardization of treatment, the shortening of the treatment. I think someone mentioned it as like a Jiffy Lube center. Kind of everybody needs to get pushed through as quickly as possible. Yeah. Is that the story you heard from other people at other clinics that were taken over by large corporations?
Absolutely, exactly the same playbook, and it's a widely recognized and widely accepted management technique. Assembly line, fast food medicine is sort of the term that's used. And I had a fascinating series of conversations with Ryan McDevitt, who's an economist at Duke, and his colleagues. And he said, well, standardization of treatment will reduce your costs and produce better outcomes. He went into this thinking, absolutely, this is going to work. This is going to work. And they have, because dialysis is the one and only big Medicare for All program since 1972. There's a huge database.
Yeah.
So for economists, they're like rolling up their sleeves and really getting into it. And he soon found that strangely enough, human patients and burgers are not the same thing.
Imagine.
Wow, can imagine
Right,
that. I mean,
yeah.
It's weird, but just stay with me for a second here, see if
Yeah.
I can explain to you. And in fact, what the techniques that are really effective at keeping unit costs on burgers low and the quality, good enough for a burger. You're not expecting, something cordon bleu, but don't work with human patients, because the very fact of standardization is dangerous. Each of us is very different. Each kidney failure patient has very different biology. Some residual kidney function, some not, some other comorbidities. You really have to tailor it to the individual. So one size fits all conveyor belt mentality is, the assembly line is not going to do it for you.
So this book and what you just said hits on perhaps the number one priority for the Justice Department right now, at least from what I'm hearing, and that's the concern about the increased influence of private equity in healthcare. And in the book, you give some of the stats: $750 billion in private equity healthcare acquisitions over the last decade, and just $150 million in 2021 alone. This inflow of money and also this use of this same playbook. Does that concern you?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very concerning. It's not new.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's absolutely the same playbook that has been played since Richard Emer got going with
We've
NME.
seen this movie before.
Yeah, we've
Yes.
seen this movie before.
Yeah.
I mean, private equity has a certain panache. They have huge access to capital. That's helpful. But one of the leaders and visionaries in dialysis, Kent Thiry, I mean, he came from Bain Capital. Mm-hmm. That's private equity. Yeah. So that's a kind of a and again, this is not just dialysis.
Yes.
This is everywhere in the healthcare system, that we have accepted the idea that you can judge a purveyor of human health strictly on financial terms. And that is a huge fallacy if you're serious about curing people. If you're just good with that, then you will get very good returns on your investment and the stock will do very well. But if you need to also to look at, I mean, that's where, people that I speak with in Italy and in Europe, they don't get it. They say, but wait a second. So this is financial, but what happens when their patients don't get well? And I say, nothing. I mean, they do very well, and they downsize some more, and patient outcomes is one of the factors. If you look at the Fresenius and DaVita. DaVita I've looked at in particular, and I write about it in my book. It's the incentives built in. Patient care doesn't really register. It's mostly stock growth and other financial metrics. And patient care is indirectly, the penetration of home dialysis, which again is a very important topic, and good on them if they do that. Mm-hmm. But mostly it's financial, and that's Harvard Business School. That's every business school in the nation. That's most politicians on both sides of the aisle in D.C. Markets are the way things operate, and so we've all bought into that, and these folks maybe are doing it a little bit more in a hard-nosed fashion, but that's a model that's widely accepted. Fast food medicine, that goes back to the 60s, the roll-up of all of the hospital, Columbia HCA and all those other Humana, they're all, who was it the co-founder of HCA, who had been the Kentucky Fried Chicken. The Kentucky Fried Chicken guru.
Franchisor.
Yeah, exactly. And then
yes.
became a Wendy's guru. And
yes.
Sure enough, this is not by accident. It's it's good business if you're turning out chicken wings, but tough on patients.
So let's talk about culture for a second. We talked earlier about your earlier book and the culture of fraud and the culture of wrongdoing and how it can quickly go off off the rails. You spend quite a bit of time speaking about DaVita through the eyes of David Barbetta, who was a whistleblower, and some of the other people that stepped forward. There was a Three Musketeers skit that really took me back. I actually went online to see if I can find a video of this skit. Can you talk about that skit and maybe some of the other examples of the culture that was seen at DaVita?
Yeah, I'm getting it through my whistleblower and current and former worker interviewees, and I've reported it in my book. But this skit it was done as a at one of the corporate retreats, and it was obviously done as a sort of a joke, right?
Yep.
But there's jokes and there's cold jokes, and this one, for me anyway, strikes me as pretty cold. And basically what it is three senior DaVita executives dressed as musketeers. And the musketeers thing is the Three Musketeers was from the refounding of DaVita out of the dialysis unit that spun off from NME when it went down. You have the Three Musketeers, Ken Thiry and by the way, Ken Thiry is a hero in business circles.
For sure.
He's got case studies by Harvard and Stanford and others written about him. He's lionized. He's fabulously successful is what he's done. Anyway, these Three Musketeers appear. Well, actually, the bad guys appear first. The bad guys are all dressed in black with black masks. And one by one they come out and they say, we've found that the company's doing something wrong, and we're going to cut into their profits. That's sort of paraphrasing their message. And then the good guys appear, and they are the three sword-wielding executives dressed as musketeers, and they play sword fight and kill the three bad guys. Now the three bad guys are an insurance executive, presumably CMS, government claims adjuster, and a federal prosecutor. Wow. And the crowd is going, yee-haw, yeah. I mean, people are laughing and they've had a bit to drink or something.
Right.
It's all good fun, but wow, that's a strong message, right? And at least drawing on interviews that I've done and the case studies at Harvard and Stanford, the leaders of the firm have tried to create this village, they call it. It's a village. The head of the village is a mayor. You join by crossing a wooden bridge, which is sort of a rite of passage, and they sing songs together and they do dances and all this. And talking with David Barbetta, he said that the whole thing about saving lives, they tell each other, stand up and shake each other's hands and say, I save lives. So really, and Ken Thiry has in videos that you can see on the YouTube, he said, we borrowed from the military, from religions, from sports, because we feel that this is a higher calling, and we want to use, just as they do, we want to channel that energy basically. So that has led some people, David Barbetta mentions, and several other people have mentioned to me to say, well, this is kind of like a cult. I haven't worked there, so I don't know, but from all I've heard, it does sound like a pretty unusual corporate culture.
Right. Certainly different from the Goldman Sachs world that David came from, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
Yes. He had just come from investment banking, and he plopped in here, and he's saying, I didn't really want to sing, but it was kind of fun at first, anyway. So yes, David was amused and slightly taken aback by it.
So David's one of my favorite people. So he brings forward allegations that the company is, in essence, buying the loyalty of the doctors, the nephrologists in the area. Can you talk about some of the things that they did allegedly in trying to buy up the loyalty of physicians?
Yeah, according to David's lawsuit, which settled for north of $400 million, and DaVita, as part of the settlement, got to say that they, the details actually were a little more complicated than that. But essentially, they were allegations that they were paying for referrals. That's the essence of the anti-kickback statute, which the suit was brought under. And so David, who was in the finance department, would first he was only essentially the company was buying private practices or parts of private practices and selling. So he was in the M&A department, which was called the deal depot, sort of. And so he would only see one part of the deal at first, and then after about a year, he started see both parts of the deal, buying and the selling, and he started to notice discrepancies in the valuations, and essentially the allegations, which were supported and brought forward by federal prosecutor in Colorado as well. The Justice Department agreed in their allegations was that this discrepancy was a way of paying doctors for future referrals, which is illegal. And but his feeling about the corporation while he was doing this, and his sudden realization of, whoa, when he was able to see both sides of the deal, struck me anyway when he described it as a kind of an uh-oh moment. There's something, and when he'd ask people around him, at first, like most whistleblowers, he was very junior, and he thought, well, they must. But when he'd ask someone, they would say, well, the CFO must know what he's doing, or something else. And so David had a, as he describes it to me anyway, a period of time when he was kind of very deeply troubled and trying to figure out what to do.
That's the story I think that comes up a lot in your book about whistleblowers too, right? Is this, I must not see the full picture, or I only understand one part of it. Clearly somebody above me is smarter than me. This imposter syndrome oftentimes comes up with whistleblowers. Is that what you've seen too?
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. It just, this can't be. And I love this culture. I mean, I love this company, and so I must be misunderstanding.
Yeah. So you talked about earlier the need for oversight, especially in the dialysis world. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah. The original, again, this goes back to '72, at a time when Medicare for All was revolutionary. It would still be revolutionary. So Congress made sure that there were a series of oversight bodies, the ESRD networks, so the end-stage renal disease networks, kidney failure networks, and they were regional because the patients and the patient cultures, and probably the medical cultures too, for all I know, in the different regions of the United States were very different, and the incidence of kidney failure and kidney disease very different. And so these were regional. They were run by people who really knew. There are differing opinions. There was a 2000, in the year 2000, Chuck Grassley called hearings on dialysis, and it had a question mark at the end. Dialysis patients in undue danger or something. I can't remember the exact title, but it was a question mark. And Arlene Mullen was one of the driving forces behind calling those. But basically, at that time, there was a difference of opinion about how effective these organizations were, but they were well funded. They were doing independent work. They were doing quality of care research, and they were receiving a very small portion of every dialysis treatment went to fund their work, and it was very good work. Since then, those organizations, CMS has just gone cost-cutting mode. They've kind of collapsed those organizations into much bigger umbrella organizations that have no real idea about dialysis. They're bidding on a low bid basis. Whoever bids the lowest wins. And I get from internal people and from people who have worked there at very senior levels that left in disgust when this happened, that they simply are not doing the job that they're paid to do, and one of the things that they're paid to do is be advocates for patient, like Arlene Mullen is. They should be doing that too, and I get it from time and again in many different areas. And I'm sure I'm being unfair to certain ESRD networks more than others, so I don't want to paint the whole organization with one brush. But it's clear to me too that from speaking with patients that they're not available. I tried to get comments from them on what I say in my book.
Yes.
I couldn't reach a living soul. I called and I called and I emailed and I called, and No one would answer it. And I thought, well, what if I were a kidney failure patient?
Wow. Right.
So anyway, it feels to me like they're not, in many parts of the country, really on top of things. They seem to have a pretty serious interpenetration with industry, which, and they seem to be, when they are communicating, they're communicating with clinics. And in several cases that I document in my book, they're basically giving a checklist for how to involuntarily discharge a patient. Here's what you have to do to get the paperwork in order.
Right.
And they, that doesn't seem to me, if that is indeed the case, they're not doing their job.
We should say, before I forget, you reached out to a lot of people and asked for other comments and feedback. DaVita did get back to you, sent over some disclaimers and their responses, which you included in your book, which I don't think I've ever seen before, by the way. Just saying, well, this is what they say. Can you talk about what DaVita said?
Yeah, well, I, as part of the legal review of the manuscript, I sent out statements that had to do with the work of individuals, of corporations, and of government agencies. And I got a very wide range of reactions, from absolute silence to we choose not to comment, to here's our three-page list of objections. And DaVita sent an extensive number of objections, basically saying that I'd got it all wrong and that I hadn't spoken with the people on the inside and that I didn't know what I was talking about. And look, I'm open to a conversation. If I've got it wrong, show me. I've done 6 years of work and talked with some pretty senior people who, if you read the book, I think, agree on a number of points that are suboptimal as far as patients and workers are concerned. If I'm wrong, show me.
Right. If we could, let's talk about this charitable organization, the Kidney Fund. Years ago, I think I wrote down the stats here. In 1996, they received revenues of $5 million total. And then just a few years later, in 2021, they received a total of $350 million. So for $5 million to $350 million, of which 302 of that 350 has come from two corporate donors, likely DaVita, Fresenius. We've seen this in other areas. Usually it's charitable organizations helping people float through the Medicare Part D donut hole. But this seems to be to help people stay on private insurance. Is that right? Is that what the primary goal of this fund is?
The fund, and I should kind of read from the book, but the fund also objected strenuously to my statements about their business practices and simply denied that I had my facts straight. And I have quoted in my book excerpts from a number of legal complaints, letters from Congresspeople and others. So I feel like I'm on pretty solid ground there. Essentially, the fund its mission is to help dialysis patients pay their bills, which is a noble thing, right? That is a good thing. You want to keep people getting the treatment that they need.
For sure.
All good. There's a conflict here, however, and that is that Medicare and Medicaid patients are sort of already paid. If they're signed up properly, the government is paying for them. Private payer, not so much. And private payer, at the same time, produces vastly more profits for dialysis companies than Medicare and Medicaid. So there is an incentive for the private company, and they say so in their annual reports. It's super important for us to have as many private payer patients as possible. There's an incentive to keep these people from transitioning to Medicare and Medicaid, keep them privately insured. But the companies can't pay their premiums. That's against the law. If there were a third party who was helping them with those payments, that would be extremely helpful for the dialysis providers, and the cash flow through the American Kidney Fund, in this case, would be also beneficial to the fund. So that's the basis of the allegations.
Okay.
But ultimately, it's much more complicated than simply helping patients in need.
We talked a little bit about home dialysis. The stats that you have in the book, about 1.9% of the Medicare beneficiaries on dialysis are doing it at home. So that leaves 98 point whatever percent doing it in the clinics. What's the disparity, especially if it's better in the home setting for some patients? I don't understand why the number's so low.
Well, first of all, the numbers are so low because straight from the beginning, straight from the institution of payment for dialysis by the federal government, there were some, the playing field was tilted towards in-center. And that's partly the handiwork of the Harvard, doctor entrepreneurs, but partly just lack of understanding probably of lawmakers. This is new material.
Sure.
The home dialysis, and all you have to do is go to a number of other countries to see how home dialysis is a vastly better treatment model. Alex Azar, under Donald Trump, head of HHS.
Yeah.
He was also the VP about Eli Lilly when their insulin charges costs tripled. He's not the first person you think of as someone who would take on a big corporation for. However, his dad was on dialysis before he got a transplant, and he knows this industry inside out. And he came up with some really strong proposals for how to fix dialysis. The administration changed, priorities changed, but he was very clear that home dialysis, and he's absolutely right, and the data follows it up. And all you have to do is go to Australia, for instance. This is one of my key advisors and interviewees, I should say, is an Australian nephrologist. I talked to a lot of foreign nephrologists just for perspective on the American system. Yep. Because there are a lot of times, for instance, in California, when there is a labor union that's doing really good work in dialysis, and they told me the story. They went to Sacramento to tell their lawmakers, look, nationwide, but also in California, look how badly patients do in America versus other parts of the world, versus Europe, versus Japan, and they said that the lawmakers had absolutely no interest in that. All they wanted to know was how is California doing versus Texas or New York or. So it was just odd, right?
Yeah, right.
Because you'd think, again, and this is sort of American exceptionalism gone again, probably. But anyway, go to Australia, go to a number of other countries. Well, almost every other country has a vastly higher incidence of home dialysis. And if you think about it, dialysis, you get up in the morning and you travel to your clinic, you wait because there's a delay, and then you get on the machine and you do your thing, but you do your thing the way they want you to do your thing, maybe not the way you want to do your thing, for as long as they want, not as long as you want. Anyway, then you have to come home, and maybe you're feeling not so great, so you sit in the lobby for a while, and then it eats up an enormous part of your day. Yeah. And talking with patients, they say, I have to sack myself up to go in, and then I go in, and then I have to recover, and then it's time to do it all again. If you had a machine in your home, and I've talked with a number of people and I've watched them dialyze, it takes a lot of training. You get that. That's the first step. All of that stuff, a lot of that stuff goes away. Some people even dialyze at night while they're sleeping. It doesn't take that bite out of your life. You can really fine-tune the treatments to your own individual biology, chemistry, and it's cheaper. Because you pay for the utilities, you pay for the real estate, you pay for a bunch of stuff. You probably have a helper, so you don't have to pay for staff. I mean, net, that's a huge savings. Right. But that requires a broad, long-term view of healthcare. And that's another thing that came out of my work in this book is that, and one nephrologist said, look, we focus on catching people at the precipice of death and treating them, which, needless to say, is a lot more remunerative, but not good as a society. It's much more costly overall, and it makes people suffer when they shouldn't. You should be working. And another fact in this is that there are something like 800,000 people on dialysis, but 37 million people who have some form of kidney disease, and 9 out of 10 don't even know they have it.
Wow.
No idea. And so they're waiting for that moment when, boom, emergency, and then it's too late, right? So if they were caught earlier, preventative medicine, that's another thing that Alex Azar proposed. Prevent rather than try to cure at the precipice of death.
Right.
home dialysis is absolutely, and if you look at how it's practiced in Australia, it's incredibly effective, incredibly humane. It's not because people live out in the bush. In fact, more Australians live in urban areas than Americans. I didn't know that. I sort of
Really
pictured
interesting.
these,
Right?
yeah, cattle stations and out in the bush, but not so.
Yeah.
It's just because they had a different philosophy from the beginning, and a few leaders who said no, we're not going to do for profit. We're not going to do brick and mortar. We're going to do home dialysis according to these principles.
When I came out of Penn Station, I decided I'd walk here instead of take an Uber or a taxi cab. And painted on the side of a building is a mural, and it's a picture of a gentleman, and it says "Dialysis patient, I really want to live." And it's an ad for kidney transplants.
Oh wow!
People donating their kidneys.
Wow.
I should have screenshot it. I'll send it to you.
I have to go. Yeah,
literally, it covers the entire.
Oh my gosh.
But isn't that really what it is about? How you can really live, as opposed to being attached to a machine for 4, maybe 3 hours, 3 times a day, at a minimum. It's very. Anybody knows somebody who's on dialysis right now, and the opportunities for organ transplants or a better life through home dialysis seems to be an avenue that we should explore a little more.
Definitely, and we really have to put them there. There's a lot of talk about patient-centered care. We aren't there. We aren't there yet. We really need to put the patient first and say, what really does this patient need? Some people really aren't suited to transplants, and some transplants do fail. But my goodness, we really should do better in the transplant department. So many organs are wasted. So many people die before they can get a transplant. People just aren't aware of the notion of living transplant. I mean, how many hearts do you have? How many livers do you have?
Right.
How many, it works.
Yes.
I mean, it really is not a problem. And yet, people are just culturally not on board with that. So we really need to do better with the transplants for sure. And there again, it's ironic but true. If studies were done in the 2010s, looking at what happened to how many people go on the transplant wait list when a unit that was privately owned by Dr. Run or smaller anyway, was bought out by a bigger dialysis corporation. Guess what happens to the number of people put on transplant wait lists? Goes down.
For sure.
I mean, these are economic incentives.
Yes.
And if you put it purely in economic terms and look at it as spreadsheet things, that's what's going to happen. That's just and you don't need forces of evil toasting, beneath some South Pacific volcano. This is just how people operate. Yeah. And if you make it economically, disincentivize transplants, then the number of people put on transplant lists will go down.
So when I met you years ago, we were talking about olive oil, and then whistleblowers, and now dialysis fraud and dialysis concerns. What's next?
Very good question. Next is a foundation that I have just been able to found with a group of really, really good people. Searchlight Investigative Journalism Foundation, which is going to tackle a number of huge problems of social concern that ultimately are considered a downer by mainstream media. Homelessness, child abuse, a number of similar issues that really need attention, are really big and difficult to handle, but may not be picked up by mainstream media. And the idea is to fund books, magazines, films, podcasts, instead of just print, and then ultimately drive change. Because this is not just about, I don't know if you noticed, but I have a few gray hairs.
I'm catching up. I got a few.
You got a ways to go. But I'm beyond the point where I'm just interested in a story, and then the next good story, and the next good story. I want to see, as naive as it may sound, I want to see change. Yeah. So I want to see change in dialysis, and I want to see change in these other things. And if putting together the right media and using them strategically can then drive change and make people on the street, but also in Capitol Hill, do something. That's what I want to do. So that's what's next.
That's great. Well, whatever you need from us, we're here to help out. I think it's wonderful. I just want to acknowledge you for your passion in this area, for spotlighting the role of whistleblowers, making people think about things a little deeper, and maybe that'll drive change. So I appreciate you taking time with us today.
Well, Jeff, thank you very much, and I want to thank you and Neil Getnick and company for the hospitality, and Taxpayers Against Fraud, who from the very beginning of my work on whistleblowing have been just incredible. Your lawyers, your clients have just really opened the door to me in so many different ways, and continue to this day. Also in dialysis, they've been incredibly helpful, so thank you.
Appreciate that. Well, that concludes today's episode of Fraud in America. Until next episode, if you see something, say something, and when that doesn't work, make sure you do something.
If you believe you have witnessed fraud against the government or fraud on the financial markets, we encourage you to visit our website at taf.org, where you will find a directory of member attorneys who represent whistleblowers across the country. On our website, you will also find additional information about our nation's various whistleblower laws and programs, and a way to donate to our organization as we step forward in spreading information about whistleblower programs. This episode was edited and produced by Rachel Brooks, and our theme song is by Connor Chaos. A big thank you to our TAF staff and researchers of James King, Emma Bass, Jackie DeMar, Kate Scanlon, Max Boldman. Fraud in America is a project of Taxpayers Against Fraud Education Fund. The opinions expressed on today's show belong solely to the guest and are not necessarily endorsed by the organization. Thank you for joining us on today's episode of Fraud in America.